Steve, why don't we go over some of the unique features in the effects section? Specifically, I'm really impressed with what you did with hyperdimension and also your distortion abilities.
Okay, yeah, great. The effects rack, as we mentioned, we have sort of 10 different effects here that you can put in any order. Hyperdimension starts off by default at the top, and it really is the only effect of all these modules that you can see has sort of two different labels. There's a hyper side and a dimension side. That's really is because it's sort of put the two modules together to sort of save space. In a sense, we have two different mix controls for each corresponding part. Hyper and dimension both get their own mix. So by default, the dimension has the mix at 0, which is dry. So by default, we're not hearing the dimension side and just the hyper side.
For those that have never heard these terms before, describe what dimension is and what it does.
Yeah, okay, so the dimension side is meant to sort of simulate the Roland dimension chorus processors.
So it's a width play. It's a width effect.
It's not really a chorus effect so much as it is a width effect. It's a delay effect essentially that has some sort of motion put on it because it's tremoloing different delay times, so you're kind of fading in and out different delay times. And then these delay times are put completely out of phase so that it sounds sort of unnaturally wide. If you know what that out of phase in one speaker sound is, it's something that's technically not mono compatible. If you sum your mix to mono, you won't hear this effect at all. It will disappear. But that's sort of the beauty of it, is that it's only there when you have a stereo playback. If you don't have stereo playback, it just cancels itself out and it's gone. So
I like this feature. Just a touch of it goes a long way for me on certain elements that I want to stand out in the mix.
That's the thing to know. I agree with you. A touch of it is kind of the way to use it, to blend it in. If you try to really lead with it, like I said, your bleed will disappear in mono, so it probably wouldn't be good to use mix at 100% on it. But to blend it in with your dry signal exactly is the way to go.
What about hyper?
The hyper control is sort of a unique, it's a chorus effect technically. What's going on is we have these sort of modulated delays, and they're just very micro. So we have these very tiny delays, and these tiny delays are all detuned from one another, with this detune control. In other words, they're all sort of playing back their delays at slightly different rates to try to simulate what happens with unison. So it's sort of a unison effect. You can set this unison amount here, which is how many of these delays do we have between 1 and 7 voices. And then we have this wet-dry mix, of course, no effect or no dry signal can be set here. And then we have this rate control, which is sort of goes hand in hand a bit with the detune to sort of adjust how the swarming is taking place on these unisons.
And where are they necessarily placed in any position in the pan field, or how are those treated in that regard?
They are spread in a sort of similar manner to the way that they are spread in the actual unison here.
Got it.
Which is that they sort of stagger left, right. So if one's going flat and then one's going sharp, they're put at polar opposites, and that sort of mixes on its way in. So they're spread across the stereo field.
Can we hear an example of those?
Yeah. So here's a mono saw, which just without it would sound like a single saw, right? Here's mix at 0.
Okay.
And here's with the hyper blending in.
Got it.
So it really gives you that sort of illusion like a hyper saw gives you without the CPU hit for one. And it can also be used, of course, in conjunction with the unison. So you could think of it as if I put 7 here, and now I can put 7 here on the effect. In a sense, we have 49, you could say, because we have a 7 stacked with all getting now delayed once again with this one. So you can, this very cloudy, swarmy kind of sound can take place.
Nice.
And so there's one more feature here, which is the retrig switch. And the retrig switch is sort of just a novel concept I had of something to add to it. Because to take a step back with the normal unison, so now I have this effect off, of course. On the normal unison, we have the ability to turn down this random phase so that, in other words, this oscillator is always starting from the same position, wherever that position is set with the phase switch. And if we have unison stacked on, what we're going to end up hearing is this detune will start spreading them apart, but they'll all start synced perfectly together. In other words, it'll start like as if it's just one saw, and then we hear them fan out. And this sort of sounds like a laser zap or sweep. You'll hear the difference here. You can hear that. And let me turn down this, slow down the detune. You'll hear it even more. Kind of like a phaser. And here's without it. Right? There's just none of it. So you get that little zap at the start. So I decided that why not simulate that on the effect. So that's what this retwig switch does. It starts them all tuned together. You can hear that little zap in there, where without it.
Got it. Very cool. Also a big fan of what you've done with the distortion section in here, the wave shaping capabilities. Let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, the distortion module I think is best heard with a simpler sound, so we'll go with the sine wave. So a sine wave, of course, with no distortion is a pure tone. With distortion, you can hear that it's already by default driving it a bit. We're hearing a little bit of the harmonics getting added in with this tube setting by default. As we increase this drive, you can see this transfer function here, which is showing us quite literally how the waveform is getting distorted. So if we crank up this drive, you can see it really starts to square off. Or
Sounds like a square wave.
That kind of filtered, slightly filtered square, not super bright, but yeah. But go up there, pretty darn square wavy. So the distortion here gives you all these different modes that you can pick from the menu. And so these are just basically, they're really just different transfer functions, and you can see them drawing here. If you really want to see them in their extremity, you can boost up drive a lot and just navigate through them. Hard clip, you can see just boosts and then square waves off, and it's going to be, that is going to really sound like a square. We've got these diodes, kind of wave shapey sound, and we have these foldbacks that a lot of guys love in the more aggressive forms of music. Almost gives you an FM-like kind of a sound. And then we have a sine fold. It's the same idea, but it's folding back in a sinusoid. A little smoother. And then the zero square is sort of a unique one I made, where it's just a zero crossing distortion. So you can see that the signal at its quietest essentially becomes distorted, rather than typically you have the loudest parts of a signal getting distorted. So it can really square wave out stuff. With more complex things like chords and stuff, you'll notice that it gets pretty crazy.
A lot of times when you're adding distortion to an element, you could be creating frequencies that are below the pitch of the tone that you're adding. We call those Nyquist reflections, right? So
that's right.
How do you address that? You have to oversample your session or the plugin. Did you take that into consideration with this unit?
You know too much. Yes, absolutely. So I have 4 times oversampling in the distortion.
Wow, nice.
So you could go more. I mean, you know, if you wanted to, if you're trying to like land a rover on Mars and you don't want any calculating error, you would probably want more than that.
That should be sufficient, though, especially if you're running at, 44.1 or 48.
It's good enough for rock and roll, is my feeling. It's just a trade-off with CPU. Maybe someday I'll add a more advanced option or setting that if people really want to heat up their room, they could raise that.
Nice.
But yeah, 4x is just implied in there with all of these distortion modes,
cool.
except one technically, which is downsample, because downsamples, we're going the other way anyway. We're taking it into aliasing land, so I figured save the CPU and don't oversample for that one.
And is that a filter I see built into the distortion unit?
That's right. We have this pre or post filtering option, so it can be a pretty different sound, right? Whether or not we're altering the sound on the way into the distortion or on the way out.
Yeah.
Obviously, if we do it pre, we're going to get all of that brightness from the distortion will still be there. If we do it post, we're really clamping down all that brightness. But sometimes that can be really desirable, especially with using a wet-dry conjunction. That way we can add some lower frequency harmonics to our signal without adding any of the harshness from the distortion up into the high end. So we still get the pure high end of whatever our waveforms we're doing.
I think you just answered a question for me, and that is how some producers get a really saturated wave-shaped tone, but they're not really crunching the high end. It still feels muted and tight and punchy. So I'm sorry, I'm just having a moment here, realizing a production tip here on my own.
Parallel distortion day for you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a neat technique. So the wet dry here is kind of not to be overlooked. You can kind of, especially used in conjunction with the filters, but in general, you can do good things with the wet dry mix. The filter can also be morphable between low pass, band pass, and a high pass.
That's cool.
So that's another good way you could tuck it in. Maybe on the converse of what we were saying, maybe you want the low end to stay nice and pure, but you want just all the weird high end from the downsampling or whatever it is. So now we'd still have that nice solid low end of whatever our source signal was, but we can have all that weird aliasy ringiness of our downsampling still taking place.
Cool.
the X shaper, I figure you might want to mention.
Please.
The X shaper is a dual shaper or a dual wave shaper, and so similar, if you remember earlier, we were talking about the warp mode that is called remap that allows you to sort of draw your own custom shape. I decided to do the same thing for the distortion, which is to allow you to draw your own custom distortion graph, basically.
Very cool.
Or your own
How do you
custom
do
wave
that?
shape. So what you do is when you select X shaper here, it will make this edit A and edit B appear that you otherwise don't see on the other distortion modes. So what this is allowing us to do is clicking edit A will open a graph, or clicking edit B will open a graph. And what this does is these edit A and B are the left and right ends of this drive knob. So in other words, we are crossfading between our A and B shapes. So in a simple situation, we could say, for instance, just turn off this filter so we're not using it. And we could say, let's just edit B. So if we just edit B, we're leaving A alone. In other words, our signal is still a pure sine wave. But as we increase this drive knob, it's going to be going into whatever graph I have here. So let's do some kind of extreme craziness here down on the quiet end of the signal. You can see that that's now getting brought in, and you can see whatever I do here over on the left side is being reflected in the graph there over on the right. So what this allows us to do is have, if we want, two different graphs doing two different sort of forms of distortion, and then we can modulate between those.
Awesome. You just throw an LFO on that puppy.
That's exactly right. So you can just drag the LFO right on there.
Nice. Beautiful, Steve. I love what you've done with both of those effects in your FX rack.